All right. So we are at the final panel. I have the great pleasure of moderating a panel of distinguished experts who are going to provide some integrative comments and reflect on all of the amazing talks that we've seen today. So first I'll ask them to introduce themselves by way of telling us how they approach this topic of human AI collaboration. So each of you, please, in 30 seconds or less, tell us, introduce yourself and tell us how you approach this task of human AI teaming and future of work.
So I'm Javier Garcia. I'm a neuroscientist and branch chief of the Hybrid Human Technology Intelligence branch, as well as neuroscience and neurotech for the US DevCom Army Research Laboratory. And we've been, I guess, as ARL, right, Army Research Laboratory, we're pretty diverse in the way that we kind of think about human autonomy teaming or human machine teaming. Within the Humans and Complex Systems division, we think of it very much as sort of like a co-pilot and doing any kind of regular task. We're very future focused on future capabilities for the Army. And so we try to facilitate and do research that is integrating in sort of like novel ways that may be missed by other sorts of agencies that are doing similar work. So for Hybrid Human Technology Intelligence, we're basically looking at the sort of unique capabilities of humans and technologies and seeing if there are novel forms of cognition when we kind of integrate technology at different kind of levels of processes in the kind of cognitive domain. Okay, 30 seconds.
Hi, I'm Georgia Chao. I'm an organizational psychologist at the University of South Florida. I do some research on teams, but what I want to share with you today in 30 seconds is basically some of my work on exoskeletons. That's human wearable technology that can augment a user's physical capabilities. And so it's currently pitched as a safety device to prevent back injuries if you're wearing a back exo. But it's also designed to enhance performance. So picking up a 50-pound weight might be experienced as picking up a 5-pound weight instead. So that opens up a lot of doors for more women and for older workers to be able to qualify for physically demanding jobs. But then it's the question of what happens when different kinds of people can really be performing at the same level because of this technology. And how does that affect the overall organization?
Hey, and I'm Dan Cosley. I'm now a permanent person at NSF, so I won't say too much about my own personal research, although I did recommender systems and user modeling with sort of an HCI and CSCW flavor way back in the day. Now I hang out in human-centered computing, which is incredibly broad in terms of how it thinks about relationships between people and technology, from very kind of social implications and social impacts ways to human factors-oriented stuff to sort of sensing and reacting kinds of things to accessibility and related topics. I also hang out with other programs, future work, secure and trustworthy cyberspace, designing accountable software systems, and a couple others where some of the topics that y'all were talking about show up.
Excellent, thank you. So first question for you all. All of the talks that we've seen have tackled really big problems, really big societal problems. And I think it's pretty clear that no single discipline gets to own any of these problems, and we need to work together. So my question for you is, why is interdisciplinarity so hard? And what are some concrete things people in this room can do to encourage interdisciplinarity?
Do we want to do a thing where we just pass?
You can answer in any order.
Cool. So I didn't get the questions memo until like a couple minutes ago, so this is a pretty fresh take. But I mean, we've seen it in some of the ways people have been talking about just your terms are different, right? Fundamental stuff like that, and sort of all the things that we know about people having different sort of, senses of what makes for a really cool intellectual contribution, where can you talk about those things, right? And so there's sort of very practical issues in building these teams. But the problem is if you don't, right, then you wind up just sort of not really understanding what's going on. And so I think one thing that I think, at least in my field in HCI, I think people are a little too confident that like user-centered design and working closely with a group of users is just going to magically solve your expertise gaps, right? Without sort of and it's important to do that, because if you don't talk to them at all, you're also a dumbass. But if you don't work with people who already have expertise in some of the things that you want to connect to, right? You're going to sort of rediscover things, or you're going to do some formative study of something that like the gerontology community knew 25 years ago. And so really sort of seeking out, sort of practically finding people who can complement the things that you want to do, and just being aware that other people care about the same topics that you do from different fields, right? There's a practical version of this at NSF, which is, well, then how do you do this in programs? And that's a hard question, because we have to recruit some set of panelists, and programs have some scope, right? But in HCC, we try to be reasonably broad in terms of how we interpret things and bringing the right people in. You can help with that by sort of being really clear about what the science you're trying to do is, right? Like if I can tell where you're contributing, I can find the right people and I can suggest the right programs. Whereas if you just say, I'm working on something, right? Or you don't put your contributions in context with other things, or you don't say very carefully, hey, I'm using machine learning, but I'm contributing to the understanding of sort of human networks, right? Then it's just really hard for panelists and us to help find the right places to send proposals to and increase your chances of getting funding for it.
I'll share with some of my early experiences. I worked at the General Motors Institute, and the students there were primarily engineers, and my background is in psychology. Trying to teach engineers was hugely difficult for me. And sometimes I would have great insight and understand how they are thinking, but it's not just a matter of learning that and then you're on a higher plane. It goes up and down in terms of my ability to connect with the students and understand where they are coming from. And I don't know how often they could connect with me. After I lecture about motivation, a student was almost in tears and said, just give me the formula for motivation. It boiled down to that, and I thought, okay, we're both speaking English, but we're not communicating, and that's why interdisciplinary work is hard. With my EXO project, I am working with biomechanical engineers, and once again, I find myself almost back in the General Motors Institute, trying to understand where they're coming from and where I'm coming from, so they can say, oh, if we're interested in EXO acceptance, just ask them one question. That's all. Why ask them a second question or a third question? Just ask them once and be done with it. And we only have to test 3 people. And so I tear out my hair and I say, no, that's not the way it's going to work, But I think when I served as a program officer, I was a rotator at NSF, and the Future Work program, one of the things that they mandated, in that program is it must be interdisciplinary, so it's hard to work with people outside your discipline, but if a funding agency is going to force it, maybe that's one of the ways that we can do it. And so the EXO project is an NSF Future Work project, and working with them has been enlightening, and it's really, I think, the only way in which this research can move forward. So like it or not, we have to do it. And if there are ways that are going to nudge us in that direction, then I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, so in my organization, we have a lot of trouble sort of like hiring like in interdisciplinary research, but it is basically a absolute like necessary kind of thing in everything that we do, because we do the foundational research that involves humans and complex systems, right? So it has to do with technology, it has to do with like different contexts, different social kind of domains, all of these things. But then also we have other programs that we need to feed our sort of research to in the more applied setting. So that's where like a lot of the engineering kind of concepts come into. So just to give you like a couple of anecdotes, like, I was a trained visual neuroscientist doing really boring, human visual processing like back in the day. And when I started, I thought it was, I mean, now, so one thing that, the Army has really pushed me in many different directions. So like in, entering the social neuroscience domain, something I didn't really know much about. Like I, partnered with an academic, so went to her lab meetings. Emily Falk is the person, if people know her. Really sort of built up sort of my background there. Now I'm sitting in, I was just telling Melissa in Chris Ray's lab, who's a computer scientist at Stanford. So we tried to actually, leverage the kind of social aspect of science, because I think that that's pretty core to every collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration and everything.
So the second part of my question was about concrete things that people can do. I noticed you mostly avoided that part because that's the hard part. But Georgia alluded a little bit to sort of being forced to do it by virtue of the Future of Work project. Is there anything else that you can think of that can sort of compel people to be open-minded or have to work together?
Yeah, I think this area just begs for interdisciplinary work. I can't approach exo use, I can't approach AI, human interactions and networks without consulting people outside my discipline, and so if you're going to do it right, you have to go and talk to other people.
So let's move on. What are some other themes that you all saw that connected talks across topics or across areas?
Yeah, you start.
Oh, no. I'm the boss. You can't make me. Well, okay, I will. Well, I think one theme that stood out to me was the importance of understanding power dynamics and the ways that technologies both reinforce and influence power dynamics, and being very aware of that in both the design and the research phases. A few of the talks explicitly focused on that, like Adam's talk and Melissa's talk, but I think it underlies a lot of the kinds of questions that we're asking, and being aware of what actually causes us to ask that question in the first place, I think is really important.
Yeah, sure. So, and honestly, this is a good exercise probably for thinking about interdisciplinarity too, right? Because trying to put your talk together with someone else's can be kind of interesting, right? And I do this in the small, so there was one thing that came up that I took a note. Oh, right. So someone said that humans are good anomaly detectors, and someone was trying to detect when humans are getting out of abandoned piloting, and someone said, hey, loan officers have a lot of expertise, right? And the idea in the piloting one was that you might want to have the models react to people and learn from that. So I was like, well, why don't we, what if you had like, clever loans, monitor loan officers who are having conversations or looking at the responses and noticing that they saw something that was wrong, even if they didn't articulate it, and use that as learning stuff, right? So that's an incredibly sort of concrete and slightly contrived, but not very contrived. That I actually put all that together as the talks were going to try to think about it, right? And so that's sort of a nice sort of exercise. Or like the question that Brian asked about, hey, how can we think about AI systems disrupting these skill networks? Could that even mean something for the way one might want to design AI systems by thinking about sort of sub-skills and kind of a Minsky society of mind way up a couple of layers, right? So there's very concrete kinds of things you can think about this. A couple of the most general themes though I saw, I mean, I'd say the most fundamental theme was sort of thinking about AI's effects at levels above the individual here, right? So a lot of people said, well, we mostly think about sort of, AI and a worker, right? Rather than AI and work or AI and organizations or AI and society. And I actually think that's in this group, a little less true, in the CSCW world, also a little less true. But I think on balance, there's very little attention beyond, what can the AI do, or what can the AI do in the context of this person or this conversation? And although there's lots of big talk about, social responsibility, blah, 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 right? We don't seem to see it sort of migrating very much into the way we think about designing or, putting boundaries around or regulating the stuff as people have talked about. So that's one theme. I've got more, but I don't want to dominate, so I'll pass.
I think one other theme is how the human AI interaction or that network really influences softer issues, the psychological issues. You know, how do we really relate to AI? And not only that, but how do I relate to other people, you know, given that there is AI augmenting some of my work that I do. So that opens up a lot of doors. And just to tag on to what Dan said in terms of taking it up to not just the individual level, but also the dyadic, the team, and organizational implications. I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, I guess kind of following up on that, like definitely, like I appreciated sort of like all of the different scales, you know, from the, let's say, dyadic sort of interactions that Paul Scheida, you know, mentioned, affecting, you know, to the organization, to societal and everything. What I think is, you know, a rich avenue of research is, of course, like connecting all of these sort of different scales. Another thing would be sort of the like physical constraints or like opportunities of each one of these systems, whether it's like technology or humans. We have, you know, capacity on information processing, kind of generally our memories and everything. These are various constraints that lead to, you know, our various kind of cognitive properties. You know, technology has, you know, some similar, but a lot of very complementary, fast speed, you know, dissemination, you know, all of these things. So just kind of really thinking about like, where, yeah, how do you uniquely kind of merge them or protect them from different things? Yeah.
Great. So related to common themes, multiple speakers demonstrated very effectively that technology is not the problem and humans are not the problem, but in fact the systems that we're embedded in, like for example, neoliberal US policy, are the problem and have led us to this place. And so can you comment on how that kind of perspective might change the way that we approach research questions or research more generally? The systems perspective. Do you want me to ask the audience instead?
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
I recently came across this notion of a Turing trap. I think one of the person who actually mentioned it, not here, but you know, the publication, the recent publication, Turing test is the one that actually drove the technology in a way that substitutes a human. Because we are testing, we're testing whether this technology is good or bad by testing whether this technology is going to be human-like or not. That's actually destined to substitute our capability instead of augmenting and complementing the limited capacity. Again, technology is infinite of their capability as well as this amount of resource or scalability. So it's, I mean, wouldn't it be better that we can shape and try to find the research direction so that we can actually make not in the trap of this Turing test, but in the trap of more, I don't know, better basin of attractor of this dynamics.
Thank you. Any other comments? Sabine?
Yeah, there's this question of, you know, what systems want to do versus what they, I was going to hand it, but you can do that one. Versus, you know, what we want them to do versus what we can do, right? Malte was talking to me about this, how we tend to approach problems from what we already know and what we already are doing and what we can already see instead of thinking about, okay, what's the new part of it?
Thanks. Sabine?
Maybe a bit linked to your discussion on interdisciplinarity, because I believe that we need to think about augmenting rather than substituting. And, you know, we have now people from the AI world teaming up with social scientists thinking about that. But then actually when it comes to control, etc., we need to include also the engineers that work on very different topics as well. And controls that are also not connected to AI and machine learning right now. So, you know, who do you think should be around the table when we do such research?
I almost want to say everybody is the short answer, you know, but as an organizational psychologist, I was brought on this EXO project because the biomechanical engineers discovered that a lot of people don't want to use the exos, even though they're designed to help protect your body and reduce any kind of back strain, muscle strain. Men in particular think that, yes, I can power through this. And if it's designed for women and old people, well, then I don't want to be perceived as someone who needs that kind of technology. And so, wow, that's a psychological issue, and so, yeah, it begs for interdisciplinary work, but it also sheds, light on how can we solve a larger problem, these unintended consequences that they saw required expertise outside their area.
So this question of social responsibility and ethics and envisioning consequences of things, this is also something I'd say that on balance, and I say this as a card-carrying techno-optimist computer science person, right, we do not have very good methods for that, and the methods we do have don't get used, right, in real contexts and real design contexts. And so I think some more thought about, is there something about the methods that make them unusable? Is it really just fiscal incentives for companies? Is it training of engineers somehow and computer scientists and other ethical technologists, right? That's kind of an important question, I think, that we should grapple with. And it applies to a lot of the work here too. There are ethical considerations and I'm also a nudger from way back, right? SuggestBot was a nudge to try to get people to edit more stuff in Wikipedia, but it has costs too.
I have a question. How do we expect to solve how we fit AI into society, given that we need publics for that and we need organizations for that? And our publics are teaming with bots already, and who has a say and who has one word is not clear. And then in terms of organizations, we are so reliant on platforms and their logics of operating, deflecting accountability, changing the rules of the game all the time. So how can we think to solve the problem of AI, bracketing both publics and platform organizations?
And if I can elaborate on that question too, I think throughout the talks, we haven't adequately considered what the role of the government is and what should the government be doing or not doing. And so if you can combine these two ideas in your responses, what could the government be doing? What are our options here?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. I mean, what's that? Yeah.
We need an educated Congress.
Yeah.
We need an educated populace to elect people who are educated. That's the problem.
Oh, is it that simple? Okay, we'll come to you in a second. Go ahead.
Just a thought on this.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna, I just read James Bridle's Ways of Being Towards Planetary Intelligence, and his solution is like, if we had like a collective intelligence that really prioritized like the public good, but across the entire planet, like it would be a better place, right? So that's the sort of, whole goal, right? If there weren't wars and all of these other things, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, depends on what you mean by government, right? So like, what can NSF do? Well, we don't set a lot of policy, right? We don't regulate a lot of stuff. We do set some policy for the research community in terms of how we ask them to ask for things and the kinds of things we prioritize. That's one thing we can do a little bit of, right? We can, like our EWF group in SCIES has done a lot of work to try to get the SCIES community to think more about broadening participation with limited but maybe some success. And there are other places at NSF that do that stuff as well, right? I mean, there have been calls. So someone yesterday mentioned a Stanford group, and there was also a ACM group that released a shockingly similar paper about the same year around sort of the encouraging people to think about possible negative unintended consequences in reviewing processes, right? But that requires both the places that establish those reviewing processes and the community to take them seriously, right? And so that means, right, that if you want this as an academic and as a reviewer, you should talk about it in your reviews and condition at least some of your decision making on things like that, right? That's not an exact answer because I can't speak for the DOE. I will say one thing about Congress. Remember, Congress, like 90% that comes out of it is congressional staff, right? It means that it's not just electing congressmen, it's trying to come up with sort of a good mechanism for bringing knowledgeable people into government who can help with the policy making.
There is actually some movement in that area. Yeah. Right. I mean, it's been a.
Yeah, because that question was also thrown at me, are they going to abuse it? I like that idea, NSF actually, at least supporting it. There are two questions for me. Basically, to which extent can we as researchers work in settings where we can actually develop algorithms that are good? Because sometimes the data and the environments are controlled by companies. So is there a way to get actually support and infrastructures that we as researchers have access to do the good AI rather than relying on things that are developed by companies or data? Because that's, we don't use Twitter, Wikipedia, but there's things you can't control there, right? And then we have limited resources. And the second thing is, educationally, do we need educational programs to make us aware? Like, we're not just talking about digital literacy, we talk about AI literacy, talk about that kind of literacy that we need to build in our educational programs.
Those are hard questions, and yeah, and I think the answers are beyond just looking at educational curricula, or looking at how can we get organizations to share some of their data. I mean, all of that is, the organization side is based on still companies are trying to maximize shareholder value. Company success is defined by productivity or efficiency. And maybe we need different ways to define organizational success that would dramatically change civilization. And I don't have the brain power to go that way, but I think that's just the way that this planet is now challenged with climate change issues. We're being challenged with AI issues. And the consequences can be catastrophic, but we have to change. I mean, we have to hope for the better, or we're doomed.
So the suggestion that, we can change our behavior to embed ourselves in those institutions, I think is really important. Like, researchers can go work with the government, they can work with organizations, and this is potentially a way to accomplish some of these goals. Along these lines, I'm curious from you, and then I'll come to the audience next too. What are some things that you wished you would have heard more about today? And Sabine's comment about workforce development is, I think, really interesting. It's not just education, but thinking about workforce development broadly and what are the implications for our research on workforce development. I personally also would have loved to hear more about how people and AI learn from each other over time, and just focusing on learning more generally. But I'll turn it to you. So what are the things you would have loved to hear even more about?
I'd like to hear more about how generative AI can affect job performance across workers. So there's some research that shows that it can enhance or augment the ability of top performers to be even better. So it's like the rich get richer kind of analogy. And that would increase the variability in performance across workers. And then how do you try to motivate and incentivize them and reward them? There's other AI that really compresses the performance variability in terms of some of the work that Brynjolfsson, I think is his name, at Stanford, presents AI augmented help for call centers and the work that they do. And so they help people dealing with customers in terms of really improving the lower level people, bringing them up to higher levels of performance with the AI augmentation. AI doesn't help too much at the top end because they're already at the top end. So we're compressing the performance variability. And then how do you deal with, how does an organization manage those people? I think those are interesting questions that can be addressed. And some people even argue the machine learning on trying to capture that tacit knowledge of high performers. Should those high performers be rewarded for that contribution? When AI tries to mimic artwork, from Picasso or Monet, well, they're dead. They can't get a cut of that action. But Beyonce, yes, exactly. Should she get a cut from her passive participation, I suppose, in this kind of AI? And maybe the answer is yes, but then how would you develop the kinds of processes to make that a fair system? Don't know.
You want to go first? I feel like I said more stuff.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so one of the sort of like big problems that the Army has kind of talked to us a lot about is sort of like, distributed sort of like command centers that are really solving like a really complex problem, right? Courses of action and everything else. So in like 20, 30 years, right, everything's going to be distributed, vulnerable. And how do you basically optimize sort of like the tasks and subtasks of a really complex problem that can take like weeks to solve up into something pretty minimal, by like, let's say, 100 times faster than what we did before. So that it would require like essentially this like taking this hierarchical structure, integrating technology into sort of like unique ways, understanding and sensing sort of like everything around you, as well as like the contextual kind of stuff, which involves everything from what's going on in Twitter to whether it's raining. So these sorts of complex problems have been on my mind. So that's what.
So it's always dangerous as an NSF person to say things that you think you want, because then people are like, oh, well, let's do that, right? And so I'm not going to say topically things that I want. I will say to the ChatGPT thing that just like when I work with secure and trustworthy cyberspace, and in 2018 we got this giant bolus of terrible proposals on adversarial machine learning because somebody put some tape on a stop sign and realized it would have social consequences if our machine learning algorithms were broken, right? And those proposals were terrible, but they've gotten better, and I fully expect that to be the case with ChatGPT and generative AI as well, in areas from human AI teaming to misinformation, right? But that's not what I want, right? Those will come. I can't even stop them, right? The thing that I would like in the general, though, is that there's this tension between wanting to say big things, AI, algorithms, platforms, crowdsourcing, right? Privacy, marginalization. And the reality that those things are big, complicated things that you have to take tiny bites out of, right? And so what I want is the community to be really circumspect about the levels of abstraction at which it is really contributing at, and thinking about methods, whether they're theoretical frameworks or design guidelines or whatever your community's favorite ways of representing sort of, intellectual tools for managing abstractions are. I want more of that, right? I want to see a story at a high level about AI and its impacts on social work, backed up by case studies of different forms of AI, that there's something interesting in common between them, right? I want to see hypotheses about, well, bots change behavior in networks and it's stupid to ignore them, and then let's look at all these case examples and try to extract, right? And as my comment on yours said, I won't buy every specific thing that happens immediately, but that's the right way, I think, to do these things. I would love to see more of that in research papers and in proposals and just in how we talk to each other. Sorry, rant off.
That was amazing. I want to ask the audience too, what are some of the themes that you think have been underexplored? And I also want to remind you that in a room like this, all the voices are important. So if you haven't had a chance to speak yet, this is coming up on your last chance to do so. So be thinking about, what are those underexplored themes, and please do put your hand up.
I've spoken a few times. I'm willing to pass. So I really felt very strongly about George's comments that we didn't talk enough about generative AI. And I'll tell you why. I got started in AI like 10 years ago in a consulting project. And for the last 10 years, the one bastion of safety for human beings was their creativity and ability to innovate. And 2 weeks ago, I felt that there was a watershed event that totally blew my mind and told me that that was no longer true. And I don't know how many of you followed this, but it had to do with fake Drake. Yeah. So if you don't know who Drake is like one of the top 3 musicians in the world, very, very popular. He's got a unique style, a unique voice. And some people using AI decided to create a fake Drake. And it wrote the entire song with his voice, his intonation, his style, the rhythms that he uses. They wrote the lyrics for it. And guess what? People thought it was really Drake. And in like 3 days, it had 3 million listens, which is an enormous amount. Then it came out that it was fake Drake. And then people were like, well, I don't care if it's fake Drake. I like fake Drake better than Drake. And then like 3 days after that, Paul McCartney, I don't know if you know this name, he was a Beatle. He's 83 years old. He's still active. He comes out with a new song. And then some people with AI took one of the verses that he sang with his 83-year-old voice and filled it in with his 23-year-old voice when he was a Beatle. People were like, oh, I like that better than just Paul McCartney. Then someone else came along, like 3 days after that, and added to that, and they add in John Lennon's voice. And John Lennon has been dead since 1980 because they wanted to have that harmony between McCartney and Lennon. Then it comes to the artists. And some of the artists said, I love it. I absolutely love it. Do you know why they say they love it? Because now they could work for 3 years, get their style, and then they could live forever with a machine doing all their work for them and never have to come up with anything again. That's pretty interesting when you think about it. And then the labels who own the artists, literally, were like, well, maybe I don't need an artist. I just need them for 3-year contract to get their sound, and I'll just make all the music I want. And then Spotify came along 3 days after that and said, do you know what? I don't need music labels and I don't need artists. I own the distribution channels and I'm going to have my own AI and I'm going to have my own stuff. And then in the end, I'm going to put Madonna together with like, I don't know, Little Richard, which has never been done. They'll have a baby and we'll have new music.
She's keeping her baby.
Yeah. So my question to you as individuals looking out over this terrain, I see this as an absolute microcosm of where we're going because almost every industry has the creative artists. You had this in some of your triads. You have the people who own the creative artists, and then you have distribution channels. And those were 3 different areas that you needed to put together a single profitable business. With AI, you no longer need 3 things. And so I'm curious from you, from a point of view of research, do you have any sense at this point what you would like to see known about this system right now that we should have research on to help inform people in the future?
Excellent. Why don't you take a stab at that? I'm going to wander around the audience in case I inspire anybody.
Okay. Wow. I'm thinking, I think recently Tom Hanks said, I believe I'm going to be acting in movies long after I'm dead, because AI is going to make that happen. And then there's legal questions on, well, who's going to get the charge?
I looked into the legal questions. It's pretty interesting. For decades, performers have had impersonators. Like literally,
Yeah.
an impersonator. I could sound just like Tom
Rich
Hanks.
Little, yeah.
They never pay a royalty to Tom Hanks. Impersonators are free to impersonate anybody they want, never pay any royalties to them. So chances are the law is going to pretty much stick to stare decisis, and then where will we leave that?
This is the dangerous part, and we need safeguards.
Anyone else want to comment on Brian's question?
Super quick, right? From a kind of, again, a SATSI point of view, things like deepfakes and misinformation and stuff are a clear place where we need to be thinking about these things.
Okay, thank you.
And then personally, I'm super excited about that. Like, I think that it leads to innovation in a different art form, like from a music standpoint. Yeah. The limits of that, though, I don't know. Like, or at least like the temporal progression of that innovation, I would love to know. Yeah.
But think about like if Paul McCartney is 23 years old and he puts out 3 Beatle albums and he's like, at this point, I'm just gonna let my robot do it. We might never have had all the great artistic achievement that came after those first 3 years. Like, to me, that's a tremendous loss. Like, you put a dent in human creativity, we're done.
Well, I mean, but was his motivation only money, or was it actually creating art?
I think most creative artists have an underlying fear, which is, I'm going to run out of gas in the tank. And this is something that they like.
Most academics too.
We have a question from Diego.
So, given this comment,
I wanted to comment on this, but anyways, no, go ahead.
We'll have time at the end for comments.
sorry, very quickly, it's just like, I know there is a huge push about generative AI, but a little bit like connected to Sabin's questions, like all of this right now belongs to all these companies, OpenAI, etc., which basically any kind of project is based on an API connected to ChatGPT, whatever. So like, it's just like a huge dependence on this knowledge that I think we don't have here. I mean, building this generative AI really belongs to specific groups or companies. So in that sense, like what should we expect? Like, are we going to make that generative AI or just be observants of all of this?
Or maybe like the weather system, right? Like each government has their own sort of like generative model of of all of the text within that country, and then yeah, basically each of your local kind of entities kind of use it in different ways collaboratively. Yeah.
I mean, NSF funds research more than infrastructure, but there are infrastructure programs, right? We funded something out of Northeastern, I think, called the Internet Observatory that's trying to deal with a little bit of this in terms of data collection and observing how people use the internet. One could imagine asking the MRI2 program to fund a $50 to $100 million instrument, which is basically a community-run LLM or family of LLMs. I don't know whether you get it funded, but you know, this is how people in physics think about things a little more. What are the big things we need as a community, and how can we go about getting them, right? But somebody has to be willing to build the telescope, right? That has to be their life, right? It has to be their research life. And so I don't know if a lot of us are willing to build the telescope.
In relation to Brian's comment about impersonators, you know, if I am impersonating Tom Hanks, everybody would know I'm not really Tom Hanks. But if I create an AI that uses his likeness, then I think there's going to be a legal issue. You know, Drake is probably suing or trying to get some kind of compensation for the fake Drake. I'd be surprised if he wasn't. And so I think it might be like a cat and mouse game in terms of we're going to have to research and find ways to out these counterfeits or these fakes, and then they're going to have to counter and try to do that. But we need something even higher than just the cat and mouse, you know, fixes and get workarounds to try to put us in a situation where we can address the greater good as opposed to good is evil, or I mean, greed is good.
Yeah, so actually it was a comment going back to what Brian started doing, I guess your question, and that is GPT. Yeah, and the research community. I mean, you know, science is science when it publishes. So there's a whole, you know, industry and infrastructure for curating what is science and preserving it. And certainly any of these generative mechanisms can interfere in that process. So now scientific publishers are having to think about what's our policy going to be about the use of these kind of AI tools in the research process, generating ideas,
And more importantly, at the moment, at least the consideration is around helping to write the document. And I don't pretend to know the whole landscape, but some publishers are simply saying it cannot be used at all, and we're going to have to make researchers attest to that as an ethical issue. Others where it could be, but you have to declare and maybe make it transparent to the entire review process. So it's not just celebrities out there. We could be targets too, or we can be wrapped up in this as well. I wonder what the panel thinks about that.
Panel?
I can throw something if nobody has anything. I mean, I'll pull this back to, I don't know what to say about the research community as a whole. I think NSF, as people inside of NSF have been like, well, what happens if, somebody does a review with it, or we start getting 80 trillion proposals written by it, and those things would be terrible, I think. And even using ChatGPT to help with a review also would be bad, because that means probably you're feeding a proposal to ChatGPT, right? That would be hideous breaches of confidentiality. But I do think it raises, going back to Brian's question about what are kinds of research questions that might be useful here, right? One is, how can we take what we already know about how people sort of use and adopt technologies, right, to think about how they're going to treat ChatGPT, right? Is it going to be an oracle? Is it going to be an assistant? Is it going to be distrusted? When and how and why and for what tasks and by whom, right? And then more sort of going to the kind of, human AI, not interaction. What was the word you said yesterday? Integration, right. So human AI integration, in the sense of, there are things that you could probably use ChatGPT generative models to do to make your life a lot easier, right? As long as you do them in sort of thoughtful, responsible ways that carry out the kind of goals that you have in doing those things, right? And so I think some research on that wouldn't be such a bad thing.
Oh, wow. Let me tag on to that. So here's an interesting issue in terms of when these call center people were using AI augmentation to help them deal more effectively with customers. They found that the high performers were not using that at first because they're high performers. They already know how to deal with customers. But after a while, they started using it because it was easier. It's easier to press the button and send a prepared message than to compose it all yourself. And someone was saying, I think, well, I know when I'm brain dead, I would just rather push the button and send a pre-prepared message. And so I don't know if that's going to degrade the top performers if they have this AI augmentation that would be good enough. And so maybe it's another unintended consequence, but we have to perhaps look at that.
I mean, I think it should be like completely and fully embraced in every sort of aspect. I think it, for certain individuals that may have difficulty sort of generating their own text, like in scientific writing or something. I've one postdoc who generally struggles with that, but his creativity in analysis, in implementing and everything else, would, without this tool, right, may be sort of left behind and not added to the general kind of society and all of this sort of impact that he can do, because everything is very text-based, like what we do. Yeah. So I think also there's a lot of opportunities in scientific writing and creativity here too, because having an entity that just makes associations between all of these really abstract, sort of constructs, whatever it is, we would be able to extract some sort of almost creativity score, or direction of divergent thinking or something from some idea that you can produce. So in a collaborative kind of setting, it seems like, well, maybe I'm optimistic about, innovation and everything else, but. Yeah.
Great, we have a question back here.
I really like the example of physics versus, I guess, computer science, in the sense that when you think about CERN, these are big governmental agencies doing the best physics research, whereas a lot of the best research that comes out of say computational social science comes out of private companies now. So I had a question for in terms of when weighing grant funding, are there any internal guidelines that weigh this? How much will this impact public good versus private good. A lot of these are like, private organizations trying to optimize, And so one, what are the existing internal guidelines? And second, how do you think they will be modified for the context of artificial intelligence?
I'm sorry, I missed the question. I
Oh,
got
I'm
distracted
sorry.
for a second.
That was my bad.
Yeah, sure. So how does NSF think? Okay, so the party line, right, is that NSF has intellectual merit and broader impacts. And broader impacts are supposed to think about things like what is the good or possible harm for society, right? In practice, that gets thought about at several different levels. Panelists talk about it or not, right? And too often, not very much, in my opinion, right? And so that gets downweighted a little bit in the discussions of it. Panelists also sometimes say, is this something that, companies should be funding instead of NSF? And occasionally we say that inside of NSF too, right? We think about this a little bit, right? But in general, if the science needs to be done, and it's reasonably good science, and the panel and the program officers don't sort of see compelling reasons why it shouldn't be done, right, it'll probably get funded if there's enough money relative to other good stuff, right? And so there's a question, well, should we change those processes in some way? Should we be much more intentional and explicit about the relationship between scientific funding and social impact? And I think the new TIP directorate is trying to do a little bit of that kind of work, although they aren't actually getting any real money from Congress, right? So that makes them not able to do as many things as they've wanted to do yet. Even though they could, in principle, get billions of dollars, Congress actually has to appropriate the money. I don't know that this is a very satisfying answer to your question, but it is sort of the best answer that I have from where I sit in NSF as a program officer, not like a leadership muckety-muck.
Do you want to take the next question, or do you want to collaborate?
No, I mean, ethics, like at least for, DevCom ARL, like we certainly, like as scientists, have this pretty regularly, and, often there are like sort of new ideas or something that are thrown at us. We always have to consider like adversarial advantage and everything like that. So we do like at least think through the adversarial kind of domain. Now, ethics, and the technology, future technology being in the basic sciences, like becomes a little murky and hard to kind of predict, but it's certainly a conversation. I wish that there was more across all of, DevCom.
We've got 2 minutes left, so quick question.
Yeah, I'd like to read a tweet by, I believe it's the real Daniel Dennett, from today. Companies using AI to generate fake people are committing an immoral act of vandalism and should be held liable. It's part of his quoting from his own Atlantic article about the whole effort to create fake people. Many in the AI community these days are so eager to exploit their new powers, they have lost track of their moral obligations. So you can go back and look all the way back to Turing in 1950. We fell in love with the idea, let's create fake people. And we kind of now take it for granted. So much of the talks here, well, fake people are here, what's happening with them? But maybe we need to stand back and say, is this a moral thing? Are we in a moral pursuit, or are we in an immoral pursuit?
Comments on morality?
By fake people, like, are we talking very generally? Like, let's say trying to, like, similar to her question.
They don't have to identify them, to behave like humans, we're trying to make them more social. They don't have, there are no legal obligation to identify themselves. Some of the Asimov stories, it was R something, R Daniel, you had to identify yourself as a robot. I mean, of course, it was part of the novelistic trope, but you identify. Here we have entities that behave like human, better and better at this. They don't identify. They don't even have to say I'm a fake person. And now we are saying, okay, well, how is it going to affect us? And you should read Daniel's article where he's saying, not in a very good way.
Let's take a question from Hedges too, and then we can combine.
So I have a very bold and maybe crazy idea here. So given that we've talked about the AI a lot and ChatGPT, And it's true, like recent findings and also consistent with my experience that the AI and all these large language models and kind of the artificial intelligence is now is driven by industry rather than science and academia. Because of this, like data, big data as well, or that only the academia. When someone says like no, data is not only not available for training, and also like large computers, it's not available for us. Now that like no, it actually remind me of this sequencing, gene sequencing in the back then when the biotech was rising, and it's like worried about how this is going to be driven by industry, then it's going to actually misuse and exploited. Now we have NIH, and I was wondering whether the government needs to have kind of NSF equivalent for the AI funding.
I love that idea, and it's a great question to end on. So given we're at the end of our panel, maybe you could just say 1 or 2 sentences about this idea or whether you're inspired.
And if I understand it correctly, like it's essentially like let's say one proposal would be like every company has to release all of their data so that everybody can do the research or
the NIH equivalent AI for AI.
Right.
Funding of this.
Yeah.
Institute of AI.
Yeah.
I mean,
Institute of AI.
that would be.
Science of AI, for example.
Putting on my Army hat here for a second, I think that it would be really great, sort of like, foster a lot of like really kind of creative solutions, lots of great research and everything like that. But it would also leave us extremely vulnerable for our adversaries to take advantage of that fully, build like perfect models, of every individual and all that stuff. So that's immediately what came to mind.
I also think yesterday we saw a slide of Pandora's box, a big monster coming out. Actually, I thought the story of Pandora was hundreds or thousands of the evils were released. And maybe that's where we are today. And you can't catch them all back. But future research is going to have to maybe be constrained by certain boundaries or certain, was it Asimov who had the 3 laws of robotics? Yeah, they can do no harm, and maybe our future research has to consider those kinds of moral standards.
Yeah, I was struck by that picture because wow, that's a really ugly version of hope there. So I don't know if you're proposing that there needs to be like a whole new agency.
No, it's more like for the regulation. Agents that can help us to regulate the development of the AI rather than driven by the profit-driven the technology advancement.
Yeah, I guess I just don't know enough about how NIH regulates health to have strong opinions on that. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, it's a sign of a great panel that we could go on for hours and hours, but we are at our end, so please join me in thanking the panelists.